So I think we're going to get going. We have a little more than 40 people for now, but hopefully they'll join us as we go along. So good morning, everybody, and hope you're all well, including those who didn't show up here on the screen. As I was saying just 2 minutes ago, my initial intention today was to take up the situation in Belarus. But since temporary status quo over there seems to be prevailing, with again mass demonstrations, as you must have seen in the press every Sunday, for the past 3 months by the opponents to the regime of President Lukashenko and his allegedly fraudulent election as head of state for the fifth term. On the one hand, and the violent response used by Lukashenko's police, beatings and mass arrests and forced exile to quell that the opposition. On the other hand, I decided instead to turn our attention today on the recent string of agreements on normalization of relation that Israel signed in the past couple of months with a number of Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and more recently, Sudan, about 10 days ago. All former enemies of the Jewish state, thus starting an unprecedented trend since in this area since the inception of Israel in 1948. Oh yeah, one more thing about a different subject that just comes to mind. Since we talked about Armenian-Azerbaijan situation in Nagorno-Karabakh last week, according to the latest reports from the war correspondents there, it seems that the fighting not only resumed, but it seems also that the Azerbaijani forces have gained considerable ground there and are threatening a couple of larger cities in Nagorno-Karabakh. So we'll see how this is unfolding in the next few days, but it seems that right now, Azerbaijan militarily at least, has the upper hand. And everybody is looking at Russia and Putin to see to what extent Russia is willing to get involved in the fighting to help Armenia. Again, just a reminder, Russia has a military base in Armenia, about 5,000 soldiers, who for the time being have not intervened at all in the conflict. So we'll see what's going to, in Armenia, but not in Nagorno-Karabakh. In Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia has no troops. But we have to see now how Russia will react over there in trying to help Armenia if, since Azerbaijan has been receiving military assistance in the past few days, significant military assistance from Turkey. So now let's go back to the Middle East. speaking of this agreement on normalization, let's see first what brought about this process. Since as recently as a decade ago, Israel was still commonly depicted around the area, as you very well know, as the source of all evil and the ultimate other. And also the Palestinian cause was treated as the most sacred thing. And yet, since at least 2009, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had been insisting against the conventional wisdom, it must be said, that Israel could build full diplomatic and trade relationships with Arab countries in the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf area, without settling the Palestinian conflict first. For the longest time, however, such a possibility seemed totally out of the question. So what has really changed on August 13 with the announcement, to everybody's surprise, that a deal brokered by the United States to normalize relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates first had been sealed? It surely wasn't because Netanyahu was suddenly more persuasive power. What really has changed is the dynamics in the region and the world in general. While the Arab Spring undoubtedly played a major role in this change, with the TV viewers in the Arab world, across the Arab world, more interested all of a sudden in hearing more about their own issues and political challenges rather than events in Israel and the occupied territories. Other factors combined as well to point the Persian Gulf countries towards Israel's doorstep. Now, Michelle, if you don't mind putting up map number 2. Such as the other factors are Washington's apathy when one of his staunchest allies, President Mubarak of Egypt, was ousted in a popular uprising, if you remember, in 2011. The US's failure to respond militarily when Syria gassed its own people, and when Iran launched an attack on Saudi oil facilities. In addition, Washington's perceived indifference to the growing threat represented by the Iranian-sponsored proxies across the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and Yemen, only confirmed and strengthened the fear of most Gulf countries that the US can no longer be counted on to play its traditional role of guarantor of stability in the Middle East. The second factor is that the growing number of diverging interests of most Sunni Arab rulers, primarily concerned with saving the regime during the Arab Spring, and those of radical Shiite revolutionaries in Tehran and their allies in Syria and Lebanon, seeking, on the contrary, to wreak havoc in the neighboring countries. How those countries immediate, geographically speaking, immediate neighbors or more distant neighbors, such as Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, Emirates, Morocco, and so on, thus came to see the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran as much more threatening to their survival than Israel. Israel, which itself perceived a nuclear Iran as an existential threat. Now, this share of common views and mutual concern led Israel and the Gulf states to first establish indirect and very circumspect contact before gradually acknowledging the process. The final push, so to speak, came with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that ended up convincing the Gulf countries that Washington was not really committed to destroying Iran's nuclear ambitions, only delaying them, nor keeping Iran pinned down by sanctions, and that by contrast, Israel was the only one player in the region strong enough to express publicly its unwavering opposition to Iran and militarily to do something about it if necessary. In addition, the Gulf countries were hearing from Egypt and Jordan about Israel's helpfulness and reliability on vital matters such as national security. And finally, Israel's vibrant economy and powerful tech sector were a source of inspiration and example for a number of Gulf leaders at a time when their focus was shifting from standing up for the Palestinian cause to creating jobs for their young people. As for Israel, in some ways, the normalization of relations with the Gulf countries, okay, so maybe I was wrong, Michelle. If you could put up the first map, thank you, thank you. I want you to see the Gulf countries, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. As for Israel, in some ways, the normalization of relations with the Gulf countries held more potential than the so-called cold peace that Israel had signed much earlier with Egypt and Jordan, countries it had fought war with. In contrast, the Gulf states were not belligerents in the Arab-Israeli conflict. They were more distant geographically. You can see that on the map from Israel. Right here, Gulf countries are right here, as opposed to Syria or Egypt or Jordan. And not only more remote or distant geographically, but also relatively more moderate politically. And they were also oil rich with business opportunities and economic interests. So Israel had a good reason to ramp up its secret liaisons or contacts in the Arab world, in the Gulf, and found that despite Arab leaders' public condemnations of Israel, in private, many of those leaders were accommodating and practical. The first sign of this new dynamic, as I mentioned to you a little earlier, did not take long to emerge. For instance, in 2015, the United Arab Emirates allowed Israel to establish a diplomatic presence at the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is a small international agency in Abu Dhabi. Qatar worked with Israel to broker a ceasefire in the Hamas-dominated enclave of Gaza. That was during the sort of Israeli-Hamas war, the last war in 2017. The Sultanate of Oman, a small, tiny little emirate, played host to Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2018. And coincidence or not, the same year, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia told an interviewer that Israelis, and I quote, have the right to have their own land, and insisted that, and I quote, our country, Saudi Arabia, doesn't have a problem with Jews. Also in 2018, Bahrain's foreign minister defended publicly Israel airstrikes on Iranian targets in Syria, writing that with Iran building up forces and rockets there in Syria, Israel has the right to defend itself by eliminating the source of danger. And finally, last year, Bahrain hosted a Trump administration conference promoting the economic aspects of Trump's peace plan for the Middle East, with the monarch there stating that Israel is part of this heritage, this heritage of this whole region, historically, and that the Jewish people have a place amongst us. All this time, on the other hand, the Palestinians showed little sign of adapting to the changing circumstances and to the new political reality in the region. When President Trump was elected and the Gulf countries made clear their intention to work with the White House on the Israeli-Arab issue, the Palestinians instead insisting on boycotting the Trump administration, failing to understand the phenomenon of Israel opening to the Middle East. Of course, the Palestinians are going nowhere, as their leaders have repeatedly reminded the world since the recent agreements were announced, and that eventually their presence in the area will have to be taken into account. But they also realized, or they start to realize, that Israel's each new agreement with an Arab country, however cold or limited in scope, like those with Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994, does weaken the Palestinian positions, making their intransigence untenable in the long run. The momentum reached its peak in August when, again, the Emirates, Bahrain, Israel, and the United States were represented. They showed up at the White House-sponsored meeting to announce their agreement to full normalization of relations in exchange for Israel suspending annexation of part of the West Bank. The Israeli pullback from annexation had a huge advantage for these Gulf states. It was presented as some kind of a consolation prize for the Palestinians. But in reality, the announcement ruptured decades of professed Arab unity around the Palestinian cause, swapping one Palestinian nightmare, which was annexation of territories in the West Bank, where the Palestinians initially wanted to establish their own state, and annexation, which, by the way, many world leaders are still considering as illegal land grab, for another nightmare, perhaps even bleaker prospect of not being counted at all. So the next question is, why is this diplomatic breakthrough now? For the Arab side, paradoxically, because of its alarm over President Trump's effort to broker an Israeli-Palestinian peace accord. Indeed, as you may remember, the Trump peace plan was heavily tilted towards Israel, essentially giving Prime Minister Netanyahu a green light to annex territory in the occupied West Bank. For the Gulf states, from their point of view, annexation would have been a fatal blow to closer ties with Israel and to everything that they have been working on for the past few years. Well, let's not forget that under the Saudi-led Arab Peace Initiative, which was presented back in 2002 and then reconfirmed in 2009 and adopted by all Arab states, with the exception of Egypt and Jordan, in 2009, Israel would have won full recognition from the Arab world only and only by resolving its conflict with the Palestinians and granting their aspiration for statehood first. So, fearing that unilateral annexation by Israel granted by the American peace plan was going to derail this exchange, the Gulf state told Israelis that they could have either annexation or normalization, but not both. The Emirates and the Emiratis even approached President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was a senior advisor to Trump on the Middle East matters, and also had been actively involved in drafting the American peace plan for the Middle East. They approached him with the same message: either annexation or normalization. But while the Emiratis were drawing a line in the sand, saying one or the other, they are also making an offer that Kushner, who was desperately seeking a success after 3 years of fruitless Middle East diplomacy, quickly accepted. So Kushner pressured Netanyahu to hold off on annexation in return for normalization, that President Trump, in addition, could claim as a diplomatic coup in this election year. So you see everybody's interest in this deal. For the two Gulf states, the Emirates and Bahrain, the diplomatic breakthrough was also a win-win situation. Why? Because militarily, it allowed the United Arab Emirates to acquire a range of US sophisticated weapons that they've been trying to get from the United States for a long time, but that Israel opposed. And for Bahrain to purchase a new defense system that they've been trying to purchase. They've been trying to purchase for a long time. Diplomatically also, it helped enhance the Emiratis' international standing, which had been deeply damaged over the Emirates' central role in a war that had turned Yemen into a humanitarian disaster, and over its proxy role in the conflict ravaging Libya. While at the same time, this normalization gave them the possibility, as I said earlier, to present themselves and to claim that they were coming to the rescue of the Palestinians, and that rather than selling them out, they were trying to make sure that no annexation of the West Bank will take place. For the Bahrain Sunni Muslim royal family, which had almost been toppled by the Shiite majority-led insurrection during the Arab Spring, and which owed its safety only to Saudi Arabia's military intervention, the peace normalization with Israel represented a kind of assurance, if you will, against a possible reoccurrence of such incidents. By helping the ruling class in Bahrain to keep the Shiite majority population in check. As for the Israeli-Sudan Agreement, you can see Sudan also on the map here, across from Saudi Arabia in Africa. Signed some 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, which was the third Arab country to sign a peace agreement with Israel in the past 2 months. It has its own economic and symbolic reasons. Not so much for Israel, actually, for which détente with Sudan could open a new, if modest, market for its agricultural, medical, and arms industries. But for Sudan, Israel's recognition is a huge deal because it removes the country from the US list of states sponsoring terrorism, allowing its economy, once again, which had been literally strangled by years of Western sanctions, to regain access to US capital and investment. Symbolically also, the fact that Sudan recognized Israel was very important, and we know how important symbolism is in this part of the world. The decision by Sudan really symbolized the reshuffling of the cards in this region. Because let's not forget that Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, was the scene of the Arab League's 1967 resolution, which became very famous, soon after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, vowing the famous 3 no's: no to peace with Israel, no to recognition of Israel, and no to negotiations with Israel. Today, and rather suddenly, Sudan, of all the Arab states and Arab countries in Africa, is saying yes to all of the above. And finally, and probably this is the most significant result of the normalization with Israel from the Arab states' point of view is the possibility that Saudi Arabia itself, which is undoubtedly the heavyweight of Gulf politics, could be moving in the same direction. Admittedly, Saudi Arabia's acquaintance and acquaintances with the of Bahrain announcement to recognize Israel was one thing. It's taking the same step might be another, and also it unlikely at this time or any times very soon. Why? Because Saudi Arabia, although an absolute monarchy, is also a much larger country with more complicated internal power structures than its neighbors. And its crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, must worry more than other Gulf rulers about public opinion and about the views of his own family. He's perfectly aware that polls still show that sympathy for the Palestinian cause remains widespread in public opinion across the Arab world, and also realizes that his country has been traditionally the most important advocate among the Arab states for Palestinians, including the positions of his aging and ailing father, King Salman, who in his very rare public statements has repeatedly, however, expressed the kind of support for the struggle of the Palestinians that defined Arab relations with Israel for generations, urging his counterparts to withhold diplomatic relations with Israel unless it accepts a Palestinian state alongside it. Precisely because of the Saudi past tenses and Saudi Arabia's status as the most influential state in the Arab world, with its vast oil reserves and revered Islamic pilgrimage sites, President Trump's administration has put it at the heart of its Middle East diplomacy. You remember that the first presidential visit was to the Saudi capital, Riyadh. Then multi-million-dollar arms sales were negotiated with the kingdom. And also that more recently, Washington defended the Saudi crown prince against allegation that he ordered the brutal assassination of the Saudi dissident, the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In exchange, the Saudis went along grudgingly, but they did, with President Trump's decision to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and his recognition of Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. No wonder if Saudi Arabia remains without a doubt the ultimate goal in Israel's long quest for legitimacy from the Arab states. And Prime Minister Netanyahu will do his utmost to achieve it. Now, speaking of Netanyahu, the emerging Israeli engagement with the UAE, with the Emirates, with Bahrain and Sudan, likely to be followed by other Gulf states in the region. There is already talk about Oman following very soon. These engagements are probably his most prominent achievement yet of what Netanyahu has called an outside-in approach. An outside-in approach that, as I mentioned earlier, runs counter to all the assumptions that Israel would become increasingly isolated and face a diplomatic tsunami for failing to resolve the Palestinian conflict. Instead, all these years, Netanyahu touted economic peace and what he called TTP. TTP stands for terrorism, technology, and peace, arguing that other countries, including Arab ones, see Israel as an ally in fighting Islamist terrorism, as a source of technological innovation, and not as an obstacle to peace. Now, today, there is no denying that Netanyahu's approach, consisting of courting the Gulf states to quietly come to terms with Israel, has been vindicated rather than Israel coming first to terms with the Palestinian issue, has been vindicated. And even Israelis who dislike Netanyahu have to admit that he's Israel's foremost statesman. And for Netanyahu personally, this recognition could not have come at a better time. Let's not forget that he is still facing a criminal trial for corruption set for early next year. In a way, the pandemic pushed this trial back by 6 months or more. The COVID-19 deadly impact on Israel is huge, and today seems to be greater than in China's in terms of compared to the population. That more than 800,000 Israelis are out of work, and that protesters call for his resignations almost on a daily basis. So Netanyahu can only hope that formal diplomatic relations will mean a great deal to Israel after its long wait in isolation. First, in terms of exchange of ambassadors, the establishment of direct flights, new destination for tourists once travel becomes possible again, and the start of or acceleration of a host of other commercial, cultural, and scientific endeavors that until now could be conducted only in secrecy. The other part, obviously, is the oil issue, the beating heart of the Persian Gulf economy. Michelle, if you don't mind putting up map number 3. Now, while much of the hoopla over the Emirates-Israel pact has focused on other sectors such as technology, healthcare, education, and tourism, opportunities for Arab-Israeli energy deals are broad and lucrative.
That wasn't 3. I'm just trying to find 3.
Yeah, it was.
No, it said map 2 on that one.
No. Okay, the 3 was the pipeline.
Okay.
Which was sent to you. I sent it to you separately.
I know, but it's marked 2.
Oh, sorry about that.
That says map 1.
Yeah.
That says map 2.
Yes.
No, you don't want either one of those.
No.
Right. Okay. So then the last map is hold on.
So anyway, I'll continue, and then you can see it on the map. For instance, Israel has been building a pipeline. There is a network of pipelines in Israel, but one in particular goes from Eilat in the south to the Mediterranean, to Ashkelon, to the port of Ashkelon. So there is talk already about the Emiratis investing into, it carries natural gas, okay? Investing into that pipeline so that this natural gas would be connected to pipelines across, thank you, Michel. That's the one. You can see it goes from down in Eilat here up to Ashkelon. Now, what there is talk about prolonging this pipeline from Ashkelon through under the Mediterranean to Turkey, and from Eilat, here it's Jordan next to it, and then right here is Saudi Arabia. From Eilat to across Saudi Arabia and to the wider Middle East, to the Gulf. So that would be a huge project. In green here, this is the pipeline in green. Now you can tell there are other pipelines here in blue and in red for oil and natural gas. The lifting of this isolation could also mean a great deal for the way ordinary Israelis think about their acceptance among the countries of the region, whether the Emirates or Saudi Arabia or eventually or Bahrain or Sudan. It's the understanding that for the first time since 1948, there can be a more hospitable region, if not necessarily friendly from the beginning for them. And they do not have to accept things as they have been for the past, 70 years plus. In contrast, now, the announcement of the diplomatic normalization had blindsided Iran, which obviously can only deplore any rapprochement between Israel and the Gulf countries, which are its chief regional rivals. Wondering in Iran what happened to the common rejection of the Jewish state by its Arab neighbors. Indeed, it was only a decade ago that the fiery denunciations of Israel and Washington from Iranian leaders commanded admiring crowds on visits to Arab capitals across the region. But that was before Iran intervened to help crush the Arab Spring uprising in Syria, before an upsurge in sectarian tensions spurred on by the political rivalry between the Shiite majority Iran and the Sunni majority neighbors, and before a wave of demonstrations by Iraqis and Lebanese lately protesting Iran's interference through its Hezbollah proxy in their domestic politics. It was also before the impact of the US sanctions on the Iranian economy, which is today on the verge of collapsing. As a result, Iran had to reduce drastically, actually, its financial assistance to its regional allies, its military has been unable to mount massive retaliations for a series of Israeli strikes on its assets in Syria, and for the American assassination last winter of a revered commander, Iranian commander in Iraq. The regional political reshuffling is also taking place at the expense, as we saw it already, of the Palestinian leadership, or rather, I should say, leaderships, who rejected the Trump administration peace plan for resolving the Middle East conflict outright as hopelessly biased towards Israel, and who subsequently curbed its ties with the administration. The Palestinian policy has been long weak, divided between the portions of the West Bank nominally controlled by Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian Authority, and his rivals in Hamas, the Islamic militant group that dominates the impoverished coastal territory of Gaza. As a result of the recent developments, the Palestinian struggle now is not just against Israel, but merely to remain relevant. While it is true that the Palestinian relations with the Gulf governments have been sour for almost a decade, with the exception of Qatar, over the lack of financial support to the Palestinian Authority's government based in Ramallah, there also has been a palpable wariness of the wider public, Arab public, with the Palestinian cause, as evidenced by the relatively muted response of the Arab street to earlier moves by the Trump administration, like recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the US embassy to Jerusalem. Reaction that, or response that once would have been explosive. So here we have, in a nutshell, the results of, and the reasons for, and the results of this political reshuffling in the Middle East. Now, the question obviously in everybody's mind is what's going to happen next? Undoubtedly, all these agreements on normalization will have to be followed by concrete measures, steps. And what we can see from the previous two peace agreements signed by, peace deals signed by Israel with Egypt first and then Jordan, concretely, they haven't been followed by a real normalization. Yes, the citizens of Egypt can go to Israel, but they don't necessarily. The Egyptian or Jordanian media are still hostile in many ways to, or wary, to say the least, of Israel. And there has not been, so far, the opening culturally in terms of exchange between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, as expected after these peace agreements were signed. So now, for other reasons, which I also mentioned, which are that the Gulf countries are further away, they have not participated in wars against Israel, so there is no bad blood, so to speak, between the two parties. And the fact that these Gulf countries need Israel probably more than Israel needs them. Obviously, it will be great for these countries to open up to Israel, but for them, it's a question of having Israel as a protector in a way, replacing the role that the US used to play in the region. So there's more reason to be optimist for the near future. Again, everything hinges now on what's going to happen tomorrow, who's going to be the next tenant in the White House. Even though in terms of the Middle East, I do not believe, I might be wrong, but I do not believe that there are too many differences at this point between a Democratic administration and a Republican administration as far as Israel is concerned. For now, for as long as Biden, if he's elected, will be president. If for whatever reason Biden is not in a position to assume the presidency, that's a different way. We cross the bridge when we get there. But for the time being, I don't see too many differences in the Middle East, in the American Middle East policy. I'm absolutely certain that Biden will not move back the US embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. That will ask for congressional approval, and it's heavy lifting, and also will not revert on the recognition by the United States of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. But that remains to be seen. Unfortunately, as you could see from the people who have been following closely the elections, and some of you have, unfortunately for them, actually, because by now I think you're fed up, that there was very, even less than usually, there was very little talk about foreign policy, once again. As I mentioned to you many times, foreign policy doesn't play a very important role in the presidential election, but this year in particular, maybe because there are fewer debates than should have been, and maybe because the American society is so polarized over domestic issues that foreign policy was totally left aside. So we'll see. All right, so I open the floor now to anybody who has anything to say about anything. Including the Israeli-Arab conflict.
I got something to say. Here?
Yes. Hi, Josie. How are you?
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you for making it so clear and for showing the maps, because
I was trying. It's not, it's complex, but
yes,
there are so many interests and so many countries and losers and winners, and the winners, you don't know if they are winners yet. That's what it looks like at this point in time.
Yeah.
This is just a picture of what's going on at this time.
Yeah, the maps were very helpful because,
as you very well know the Middle East, that can change tomorrow.
yes,
but for the time being, that's what it looks like at this time. How things are going to change again. the Middle East, obviously, with a U.S. election and everything that can happen in the Middle East also, you can never tell from one day to next what's going to happen. That being said, I was trying to give you a picture at this time, why this normalization process has started, why it was accepted by a number of countries that previously rejected it, and where this should lead. Now it remains to be seen how this is working.
Question.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I inferred, and maybe wrongly, that the initiation of the peace plan that the White House claims credit for was actually in the works quite a long time before the Trump administration, and he saw an opportunity and jumped on it to take credit and kind of expand that peace plan. Is that correct or not?
I don't know if the Obama-Biden administration started a peace plan. I
was thinking
if you ask me, if you ask my feeling, okay, I can only give you my feeling. I don't know for a fact, okay. That being said, my feeling is that when I look at the peace plan and when I look at the position that the Obama administration took towards the Middle East, I would tend to believe that Kushner was the main drafter of this plan. And I tell you why. There is one reason. If you remember, one of the last actions that the Obama-Biden administration took on the Middle East was maybe 1 month or a month and a half just before the elections of the presidential elections in 2016, when at the Security Council of the United Nations, the US delegation abstained on a resolution, and that was for the first time ever, abstained on a resolution presented by some Arab countries, which condemned Israel's position of annexation of settlements or opening of settlements on the West Bank. And that resolution was adopted over the abstention. The other countries voted for in the Security Council. And since there are no veto on the American side, it was only abstention. The resolution was adopted.
But so I wasn't thinking.
Just a second, just let me finish.
I'm sorry.
This peace plan was heavily tilted towards Israel. So I don't see how the same administration, which is the Obama-Biden administration, would have abstained on a resolution condemning Israel, and at the same time working on a plan which turned out to be so tilted in favor of Israel. So I believe that this plan was mostly fathered, so to speak, by Kushner, by the ambassador of the United States in Israel, and by the special envoy of the United States to the Middle East.
But I was thinking that, you know, when you started the lecture, that you were saying, I mean, as I said, again, I inferred that a lot of the Arab states did a lot of the preliminary work themselves, that they were kind of beginning to come together and recognize the importance of Israel to their own economies. And that, I mean, I wasn't thinking about either administration at that point.
Well, I don't believe that, I don't know. It could very well be that behind closed doors, if you will, the Obama administration was encouraging the Arab states to talk to the Israelis and the other way around. But it is a fact that there was a multiplication of contacts, diplomatic contacts between the Arab state, between the Gulf states and Israel, starting in 2016, 2017, when the Trump administration was in charge already. So I do not, honestly, I do not believe that Trump administration, in this particular instance, I do not believe that the Trump administration took credit for a plan that the Obama administration had put in place already. It might have started working on something that, again, I don't know. I have no idea if the Obama administration was working on a plan. I only know that the Arab countries were very reluctant to work with the Obama administration because of the Iranian deal signed by the Obama administration, which the Arab states, particularly the Sunni states in the Gulf area, were blaming the United States, saying that, well, that does not resolve the issue. It only kicks the can down the road. And in 2030, according to this deal, the Iranians will be allowed to resume their nuclear program, military program. So that wasn't really taking into account their concerns for the future. And the Americans at the time, the previous administration, answering back that, well, this deal is better than nothing, number one. And number two, between the time that the deal was signed and 2030, maybe, just maybe, the Iranian authorities will warm up to the rest of the world and maybe they'll abandon their nuclear plan to build a bomb. Well, that did not happen. Even after the deal was signed, I remember a speech that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, made in Tehran by saying, we signed the deal with the United States indeed, not only with the United States, but we have this nuclear deal. But we're not going to improve our relationships with the evil state, which was the United States. They cannot expect us to have better relations with them. And that was after Obama sent them, if you remember, $150 billion in cash over there. So I would say that, again, I might be wrong. Like, I don't know what the dealings were behind closed doors, but I do not believe that Obama's administration was at the heart of the deal that Trump has finally put together. So that's my feeling. I might be wrong, but that's my feeling. As much as you might not like it.
No, that wasn't my question. That wasn't my, as I said, I think what I thought was that the U.S. administrations were not a part of this, that the Gulf states, if you will, the Arab states.
Oh, you mean they did it by themselves?
They were kind of thinking along those lines themselves.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
So that was my question.
With you, but again, as I mentioned in my presentation, what made them this Gulf states made them really go ahead and actively talk to the Israelis was paradoxically the fact that the American peace plan was tilting so much in favor of Israel. They were afraid that after establishing contact with Israel, they'll have to stop because publicly they cannot accept a plan which would give Israel the annexation for nothing. So they came to the Americans and said, let's take advantage of this situation and tell the Israelis, or will tell the Israelis, that they can have either one, annexation, which will which will start a new set of issues because as you know, annexation is not recognized by the international community. So they can take over, I don't know, 30% of the land in the West Bank, but then never have any peace with us, because publicly we cannot come out in favor of annexation and still continue talking to them. That's out of the question. Or they can have normalization with us and just drop the annexation. Not forever necessarily, okay? But just drop the annexation. So Kushner, since he wasn't going anywhere with his peace plan, with the Palestinians rejected it outright, said to himself, this is better than nothing at all. This way, Israel, which had peace normalization, peace agreements with a number of Gulf countries, and they won't have the headache of annexing territory that other countries will not recognize, and then the United States will be blamed for it. So might as well, persuade Netanyahu to just drop the annexation for now. Listen, annexation wouldn't have changed anything on the ground, because Israel is still in a number of areas where the settlements are on the West Bank. So they're going to stay there. They are not going to move back to Israel proper. They're going to stay. The settlements are where they are, and they are not going to move. So practically, that doesn't change anything for Israel, annexing or not annexing. In exchange, however, they have the normalization with the Gulf countries. So it was a win-win situation for Israel as well, not only for the Gulf. And for Trump, it was a diplomatic coup. Undoubtedly, it was a diplomatic, very few of them, but this was a great coup. I mean, to have peace between Israel and the Gulf countries. So everybody was a winner, except for the Palestinians, obviously, and Iran. But that's exactly what that was the goal also.
Okay.
So I hope I made myself as clear
Yes,
as
thank you.
possible. All right, we have a few comments here from Jack. Thank you for your clear helpful. You're welcome. From Don, what's going on in Syria now? Future? Well, that's a good question. What's going on in Syria? There is not much fighting reported in Syria. Everybody is on its own positions. But apparently, al-Assad is normalizing, quote unquote, the situation in his country, and slowly but surely is taking back all the regions, with the exception of a couple of them where there are a few Americans left, as you know, and but with the help of the Turks, definitely is in a position to slowly and progressively clean the country, so to speak, and get it back to him. Now, normalizing the situation in Syria, that's a totally different proposition, because to normalize the situation in Syria, you have to rebuild Syria. Obviously, you know, I mean, this civil war just destroyed not only the infrastructure, but destroyed the cities. There is nothing left. So the idea was that after the war with al-Assad gone, the Americans and the usual donors would come into the countries. Usually they organize meetings and fundraising, and billions of dollars will be raised to invest into the Syrian infrastructure. Now, al-Assad is still there. So for the Western countries and for the United States, it's out of the question to help Syria financially. Russia, as much as they like to help Syria, do not have the means themselves to help the Syrians by themselves. The Arab countries are are not looking at Assad as a great friend. So they're not going to help. And the Turks, who might also like to help Syria, they can help them only militarily, but not financially. So Syria is there, but destroyed economically. So that's what the future holds. Nobody knows. Not to mention that with this pandemic and everything else that happened in the world in the past year, Syria was last concern on people's mind, especially that there are no more fightings there. So nobody knows what's going to happen. For the Americans, the only concern in Syria is if Al-Qaeda or ISIS would start to rebuild its forces. But that doesn't seem to be happening for the time being, or at least I don't know about it. It hasn't been mentioned. So for the Americans, as long as we have a status quo in Syria, one way or the other, it doesn't make much of a difference. From Sherry, given what has transpired in the Middle East, it seems like a two-state Israel-Palestinian solution is off the table. Is that something that can still happen? Absolutely. Now, I mentioned to you 5 minutes ago that as far as the Middle East goes, I see not much difference in what the democratic administration would do if Biden gets elected. That being said, a democratic administration would insist more on a two-state solution that has traditionally been the American position on the Middle East, on the two-state solution with the Palestinians, which in turn would have to bring back the Palestinians to the negotiating table, because the Israelis might argue that they have to have someone to talk to. Obviously, if the Palestinians want a state, then they have to have an interlocutor sitting across the table from them. So in that respect, while the Trump administration, I guess, what the Trump administration is saying nowadays is for the Palestinians to come back to the negotiating table if they want a state in what is left from the West Bank. And he's also pushing the Palestinians, the administration is also pushing the Palestinians to first sweep in front of their door and try to find some kind of common position, joint position between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority before even sitting down at the negotiating table. Because if you have 2 or 3 different factions in the Palestinian on the Palestinian side, there is no way to negotiate. So we'll see what happens. The Trump administration didn't really give up on the two-state solution, but it is not pushing it too hard. On the Democratic side, definitely there is a focus on the two-state solution still, and that I think Biden mentioned it a couple of times. So we'll see. We'll have a clearer answer to this after. I was going to say after tomorrow. Who knows?
No way.
After the outcome of the elections, whenever that is. From Steve, if Gantz ever takes control in Israel, what is his view relative to Netanyahu? Well, he made it clear what his view was relative to Netanyahu before when he was his opponent. And he said that he will never be part of a government led by Netanyahu, who's indicted for corruption and breach of trust. And where is Gantz today? He's vice prime minister of Netanyahu. So I don't know what his view of Netanyahu is, if it has changed, or but obviously as a politician, you can never, the views are shifting very easily. So I don't know what he's still waiting for Netanyahu to go on trial and probably take position at that time. But for the time being, they seem to work out very well, being in the same government.
My question had to do with his view relative to these agreements being signed by Israel right now with the Arab states, because he's supposed to take over in 18 months after that.
Supposedly, yes.
Yeah.
Well, he can only approve it. Number one, because he's part of the government. And number two, because the Israelis see no reason why not to take the deals. But the Israelis in general were not particularly sold on annexing parts of the West Bank. Because again, as I said earlier, most people in Israel pointed out that whether they annex or don't, nothing changes. In other words, the Israelis will still have settlements on the West Bank, and they will still control militarily that area. And not only that, but one advantage of working with the Palestinian Authority was that in terms of security, the Palestinian police was very helpful to the Israelis also. Their cooperation was real and efficient. So the Palestinian police, if you will, keeps the lead on the West Bank, so that Israel can concentrate a little more on what's happening in Gaza and on the Lebanese border with Hezbollah. Herbert, considering the state of Iran's economy and the new agreement, and then it stopped. From Alan, we should not forget that the primary goal of this initiative was the settlement of the conflict over the status of the occupied territories. And these rapprochements, while significant, as secondary and only indirectly relevant to the primary goal. Well, Alan, I think that's how it was presented. I don't know if I agree with you. I don't know that the primary goal was a settlement of the conflict over the status of the occupied territories. All the more so that I like to point out to you that the annexation has not been canceled, okay? It only has been suspended. There is a difference in terms there, and which means that the threat of annexation is still there. At a later stage, if things change, it's still there. And that the United States still recognize the right of Israel to annex territory in the West Bank. I believe that the primary goal for the Gulf states and for Israel was to have economic and diplomatic relations between them, irrespective of how the Palestinian issue will work out. From Lori, what's being done to get buy-in on the new plans from the Palestinians and their worldwide supporters, as well as from Israel's Orthodox Jewish community? Without this, it seems like a country club deal that will help only the top strata of society. Well, from the point of view of Israel's Orthodox Jewish community, normally the Orthodox Jewish community does not get involved in Israel's foreign policy. Is such a deal good for the Orthodox Jewish community? I don't know. Unless there are very few Jews left in the Emirates, if any. So I don't know one way or the other how the Orthodox Jewish community can be helped or deprived of anything by this deal.
Well, if there's not going to be annexation,
Sorry?
if there will be no annexation.
Oh, you meant if there is no annexation. I thought you meant about the deal itself.
No, sorry.
Okay. About no annexation. Obviously, then the Orthodox Jewish community is directly involved because, as you know, there are some settlements which by Orthodox Jews in the West Bank. Again, it doesn't change much for them either because the settlements are there. So I don't think Israel would have taken over more territory from the West Bank by annexing territory. It would have only made it official, the presence of Israelis, including Orthodox Jewish Israelis, in those areas. So basically, since these communities are in the areas which Israel considers Jewish going back 5,000 years, it doesn't change much since they are not pushed out from there. I don't know what you mean by it's a country club deal that would help only the top strata of society.
It seems more like an economic deal that
Diplomatic also, military also. It goes beyond economics, and do not forget also that an economic deal that helps Israel has repercussion and consequences for the entire population. It's not only for the top class of society.
So you're saying the benefits will trickle down?
Yeah, definitely. To some extent, they will. Yes. If the economy is booming in the Middle East between the Israeli know-how and the Gulf money, this could be huge for everybody concerned. It could be huge. So it goes well beyond just a country club deal. From Tom, what do you feel will be the lasting effects of the massive explosion that rocked Beirut in August? Will it cause further destabilization in Lebanon or lead to a push for long overdue reform in its corrupt government, or both? But so far, it doesn't look too good. It doesn't look too good because, as you might, if you follow Lebanon a little bit, you must have seen that it's we're going back to where we were a year ago. Macron insisted when he went to Beirut a couple of times that, or at least condition international help and assistance to rebuilding Beirut to changes, political changes in Beirut. But so far, it doesn't look too good. You might have seen that the new prime minister, it's an old prime minister. They took back Harari, who was prime minister a year ago. So it doesn't look too good. It seems that the finance minister will be a man picked by the Hezbollah. And the financial minister is extremely important in that country, much more so than being prime minister, because the finance minister, he's the one who's in charge of the money in Lebanon and distribution of money. And so having someone from Hezbollah doesn't look too good. And as long as Lebanon is not strong enough to get rid of the Hezbollah Iranian proxies in Lebanon, there will be no changes. So as much as Macron threatens the Lebanese leadership with no money, Hezbollah will never give up, backed by the Iranians, will never give up on leading the country, because for all intents and purposes, their militia is stronger than the Lebanese army. And their implementation in the government is very, very powerful. So it doesn't look good to me. There will be there are long overdue reforms. I agree with you. It's a corrupt government. I agree with you. But there will be no reforms as long as the Hezbollah is setting the table there. And that seems to me, with Harari's return as prime minister, that's going to continue happening there. Anything else?
With Lebanon, it's meet the old boss or meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right?
Yeah.
Just bringing in the same, and their unemployment rate is like 50% there. Poverty, corruption, everything. The last thing they needed was that explosion in August. So talk about kicking someone when they're down.
I agree, but they haven't done much. And from what I understand, I know a couple of instances in which a couple of friends who lived in Paris for a long time, and then they were hoping to go back to Lebanon, and they did go back to Lebanon actually for a couple of years, and now they're getting ready to leave again. And they are not the only ones. The new generation is desperate and see no future there. So they're those who can anyway financially are getting out. From Claire. From families I know who lived in Lebanon for past decade, it is causing further destabilization to the point that families who are American citizens move back here this summer. It's exactly what I was saying. That's exactly what I was saying. I know a couple of people who are, since they are French speaking, and France is closer than they have, obviously. Most of them have family, or they have dual citizenship also, French and Lebanese. They're getting out of there, saying that it's a lost cause, Lebanon, which went through 15 years of civil war with Syrian influence there. Finally, being able to get rid of Syria, or at least getting Syria's army out of Lebanon. Now to have the Iranians coming in with the Hezbollah. So it doesn't look good. All right, so next week, I even hesitate to say it, maybe we have something on the elections. If there is something on the election to talk about by next week. Oh, there will be a lot, but not necessarily in terms of foreign affairs, but we'll see.
I think you're a glutton for punishment.
I'm still planning on having something on the elections, and some reactions from other countries, but I'm not holding my breath. We'll see what happens.
That'll be fun if you get reactions of other countries and present them.
Yeah, but the reactions of other countries, again, I can, if you ask me about reactions of other countries, I can tell you now what the reactions of other countries are. No, seriously, because they all made it public, or in private. You can guess more or less which countries. For instance, just to give you a few, Central European countries. Okay, they are pro-Trump because they see in Trump someone who's going to. Someone who's strong, who's a strong leader, who sent troops and weaponry to Poland, to the Czech Republic, and who was a guarantor of their security towards Russia, wrongly or rightly. Okay, they are pro-Trump. They like his style. The Western countries, part of the European Union, are not particularly taken with Trump, except for the UK. Okay, the UK is not a public opinion. Also, then you have to look at the public opinion. Public opinion doesn't care for Trump that much, based on style mostly. Okay, and behavior and style. The British government, however, the Conservative government, still is hoping for a trade deal once the UK finally leaves the European Union, if they ever will. That's a different story. And they counting very much economically and financially speaking on a deal with the United States. Now, if the Democrats are elected, the Democrats might not be pushing for a deal unless the UK, England comes to some kind of agreement with Ireland, what to do with Ireland. Trump doesn't care. For Trump, this is an internal issue, and a deal, an economic deal, will be signed if it's advantageous also for the United States. It's a different way, again, transactional diplomacy. It's a different way of looking at it. So in England, in the UK, the leadership is in favor of Trump, and they hope that he will be re-elected, whereas public opinion, not so much. Now, the other Western, the continental Western members, states, they don't know exactly. I mean, they know what to expect from Trump, and they don't like it very much, obviously. when are being told all the time, give more money, participate in NATO, more. But at the same time, they don't know what to expect from a Biden administration. So they are sitting on a fence over there. In terms of, again, in terms of government, needless to say, the Palestinians are all in favor of Biden, counting the days and the hours and hoping they have no plan B. For the Palestinians, it's either Biden, but they don't realize that Biden, again, will not change totally what Trump put in place. It won't happen. The Israeli embassy will not go back to Tel Aviv. The United States will still recognize Jerusalem as a capital city of Israel. That will not be an issue. Again, what might be an issue is to what extent the American diplomacy will insist on the two-state solution, and for the Palestinians to have a piece of land also that they call their state. But they cannot expect too much. It will be unrealistic to expect too much from the US administration. And then you have South America, which has no particularly opinion except for Brazil, which is very close to Trump. Bolsonaro, the President Bolsonaro, again, the president and the leadership of Brazil is hoping for Trump to be reelected, if nothing else, because of all the other countries taking positions again. You remember all these fires in the Amazon and blaming the government for having, in a way, facilitate all this environmental disaster, whereas Trump has never said a word about it. So definitely Bolsonaro would like Trump to be reelected so that he won't have much pressure from neighboring countries. The African countries which have no position one way or the other, it doesn't change much for them, because neither administration was taking much interest in Africa per se up to now. So there will be no change, no matter irrespective of who's in the White House starting in January. So in a nutshell, that's a reaction from other countries. What would be different, obviously, is after the elections, how other countries react. But we'll see. If we have a result here also, that's another story. We might not have everything definitely tomorrow, or tomorrow, or the days to come, or who knows? Might go to the Supreme Court, it might, who knows? But I don't want to speculate. It's bad enough as it is now. I don't want to speculate. But I still would like to do something on the elections, obviously, next week, for next Monday. We'll see.
So we'll move from discussing Lebanon's civil war this week to America's civil war next week.
Well, you're a pessimist.
Hopefully not.
You're really a pessimist. I mean, civil war. Well, in case we have civil war, we might not have Zoom and won't be able to.
Well, that'd be terrible.
This meeting is indefinitely delayed.
We won't be able to communicate anymore. But let's stop here today. All right. So have a nice week.
Thank you.
Not too eventful. And then I'll see you all next week. And it's very much up in the air. I still count on doing something on the election. All right.
Thank you.
See you all. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Pierre.
Thanks, everybody. See you next.
Thanks, Pierre.
Michelle.
Take care, Pierre.
Thank you.
Michelle, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Katie sent a note, not to me, but to everybody, to the instructors, okay?
Yeah.
To the effect that in order to make the payments, we have to send in the form, you know. It seems to me that I've done it. I asked when it was first, those forms were sent out.
Yeah, I don't know what form she sent you, but I know that she needs a,
I know because every cycle there is a form that is sent to me that
Right.
I have to scan. I mean, I have to sign and
Right.
send it back. It seems to me that she already sent it out. To me, anyway, I received it, I scanned it, I signed it, and sent it back.
Right, but what about, are you talking about your quote or your invoice?
My invoice, yes.
Is that what you, is that
invoice.
what?
So could you find out from her if you're
I think it might be better if you just send her an email.
okay.
Because I don't want to go back and forth
All right.
necessarily. It might be easier.
And I don't want to get you in the middle also.
Yeah.
Okay. You have enough.
We'll get back to you.
Although with
handles all the payment, and I'm not really that.
With your son who has a virtual girlfriend, you have more time to yourself.
All right. Thanks, Pierre.
All right. So have a nice. Do you work from home also, or what do you do?
No. I'm working out of the Edgemont Park House.
I'm asking you that because Katie's emails say I come into the office only once a week, twice a week?
No, she's actually she's working from home all the time, but it can only work from home 3 days a week. So the other 2 days, she essentially is sort of furloughed herself because she's got 2 little kids at home, and she's
I know. Yeah.
And they're they're homeschooling, so it's tough.
Oh my God.
So my son's in high school, so I don't understand trigonometry, so I can't help it all.
Well, I couldn't help them with trigonometry, with geometry, even in middle school,
it's all way beyond my skill set. So
me too. That's what
I come into the Edgemont Park. I'm alone here, but it's a nice sunny place to work outside of the home because it's just dogs barking. It's actually better for me here.
Well, they lost me in fourth grade, I think, in terms of math and science, and not only this is taught differently from the way I was taught, but in addition, it goes over. It's much.
Oh, absolutely. All right.
All right, Michelle. Thank you again, and see you next week. Be well.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.